it's not a funny story, but Matt is the son of Tom Cravens and Gene Dirks. And many Boy Scouts do an Eagle Scout project when they get to a certain level. And a lot of times, within a few years, those projects are either forgotten, dilapidated, or rotted away. But Matt Cravens built two very sturdy benches, which are out by the trees on the east lawn outside our sanctuary, and are just as strong and usable today as they were the day they were built. And there's a little plaque on each of them to recognize his work.
Okay, I found a few additions here. Matt, as you know, grew up in Lawrence and attended the Unitarian Fellowship of Lawrence, as it was then. And now with his wife and a daughter, he was living in the Washington, D.C. area until 2019 when he moved back to Lawrence, and picked up with the fellowship again. And his daughter, Matilda, is 2 years, 10 months, his sunshine. And he currently works as Douglas County's Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, works for them as an analyst, previously worked as statistician for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Citizen and Immigration Services in Washington, and as a senior associate in research for the Pew Charitable Trust. So with that introduction, double-barreled introduction, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Matt Cravens. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much, Paul and Graham. Can everyone hear me okay? Great.
Okay.
Well, I'm honored to be giving a talk today as I just signed the membership book and officially became a member again, so to speak, because I grew up going to the fellowship, but I signed a membership book as of this year, pre-COVID. So back when you could sign things in paper. So I'm glad to be giving a talk today, and I will attempt to share slides now. All right, so this talk will be addressing racial and ethnic disparities in jail stays in Douglas County. And this is based on work that I did for the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council starting way back in February. So this has been ongoing, and it happens to be a very timely and important topic right now with all the protests and everything in the wake of George Floyd's death. So I think this is a particularly useful time to talk about this, but it did start well before COVID. And so I'll, with that, just get into the talk. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that the criminal justice system in Douglas County is complex. This is a flow chart summarizing several steps in the system. And in this presentation, I'll be analyzing data on people in jail, so people at 2 points in the system. And the first point includes people in jail following arrest at the pretrial stage. The second point includes people in jail following sentencing by the court. So in other words, we're analyzing a couple pieces of a large and rather complex system. And while we'll be analyzing racial disparities in jail stays, I'm not devoting a significant amount of attention to identifying the specific points in the system where the disparities arise. We'll attempt to pay some attention to that issue, but in this analysis, we're more concerned with documenting the extent of the disparities. So let's start by looking at the distribution of the Douglas County population by race and ethnicity. It's about 83% white, about 6% Black, 4% Native American, 6% Asian, and 6% Hispanic.
I'm surprised that's that low.
Now we can look at the population booked into jail in 2019. The percentage that is white is lower, the Black, Native American, and Hispanic percentages are higher. In fact, about 18% of people booked into jail are Black. This by itself is actually pretty strongly suggestive of disproportionate minority contact by law enforcement, either in terms of law enforcement stops, calls for service or warrants being served or arrests, because unless Black residents are committing offenses at about 3 times the rate of whites, then there are too many Black residents being booked and arrested into jail. So this would suggest some biases in who's being targeted by law enforcement and or who has warrants out for them. But I want to say that the county is currently conducting a study of law enforcement contact and minority contacts to determine this more definitively. So we're contracting with Northeastern University researchers in Boston to sort of identify whether or not traffic stops have a sort of disproportionate minority contact. And that analysis is being extended for another 6 months because of COVID. And so we'll probably have some results for that law enforcement contact study in about a year. Now, here's what the distribution for the jail population in Douglas County looks like. As you know, there's one jail, the Douglas County Correctional Facility. The white percentage here is even lower and the Black percentage is even higher. 25% of the jail population on this date was Black. So in sum, there appears to be a disproportionately high share of Black residents in the population of jail bookings and in the standing jail population. I'd like to add a couple notes. One, this is an important note. If you look only at the jail population that resides in Douglas County, the racial and ethnic distribution looks almost identical to the full jail population. So in other words, we don't reach a very different conclusion about disproportionality of jail incarceration if we only analyze Douglas County residents. On any given day, about a third of the jail population does not live in Douglas County. And just another note in these analyses, the Hispanic and race categories are not mutually exclusive. So a person can identify as both white and Hispanic or Black and Hispanic, but the vast majority of Hispanics are in the white group. And most of these analyses have been rerun after treating only non-Hispanic white inmates as white, and the results don't differ noticeably. So just to step back, this is a reminder that the jail booking population is different from the standing jail population on any given day. So here's a figure to the left showing that about 70% of people booked and released from jail are released within 72 hours. Basically, there's a lot of churn, so to speak. As you can see, there are thousands of bookings and releases every year, about 4,350 in 2019. By contrast, the standing jail population tends to be people staying much longer. So 75% of people are staying up to 220 days. And there were only 134 people booked into jail on 4/30/20. These people are people who are booked into jail after arrest and not able to make bail, or people who are not eligible for the release under the pretrial release program, or there are people who are sentenced. So again, I just like to reemphasize that there's a lot of churn in the jail population, but the people who are staying much longer, and that population that's staying longer tends to be disproportionately Black. So the jail booking rate is a useful statistic for summarizing racial disparities. We calculate it by taking the number of bookings for each racial group and dividing it by the population for that group in thousands. The result is in the right-hand column. The white rate is about 34 bookings per 1,000 residents. The Black rate is about 107. The rates for Native American and Hispanic residents are slightly higher than the white rate, and the Asian rate is much lower. So this basically indicates there are about 11 bookings for Black residents for every 100 Black residents. And, you know, I should emphasize that that is a lot. These are not unique people booked into jail. So if it were unique people, it would mean that like about 11% of the Black population in Lawrence or Douglas County, is being arrested. And not everyone who's in the Douglas County jail is actually a Douglas County resident. But what we can kind of do is backtrack some numbers and say, if we assume that about maybe each person is booked twice into jail, and maybe about a third of the population isn't from Douglas County, we can say that maybe about 4% of the Black population in Douglas County is arrested and booked into jail each year. And that's quite a lot. In fact, really the ratio of the Black rate to the white rate is quite high and something that should be alarming to a lot of people. So we can look at these rates over time to see if anything's changed. For all groups besides Hispanics, the jail booking rate has actually declined from 2017 to 19. However, the ratio of the Black rate to the white rate has not changed much. So basically the rates have declined because the number of bookings declined a lot in 2019 and a little bit in 2018, except for Hispanic residents. But because the white rate declined too, the ratio, which we use to measure the disparity, has not declined too much. This is the ratio of the jail booking rate for each racial group to the white rate. In other words, the black jail booking rate is 3.1 times larger than the white rate. The Hispanic rate is 1.3 times larger than the white rate. And again, as I mentioned before, unless black residents are committing offenses at about 3 times the rate as whites, this jail booking rate ratio indicates some sort of bias or disproportionality. Using the standing jail population, we can also calculate jail incarceration rates and the ratio of each group's rate to the white rate. The black rate is about 4.7 times larger than the white rate, and the Hispanic rate is about 1.3 times the white rate. Nationally, the black jail incarceration rate is about 3.2 times higher than the white rate. So the 4.7 number I just quoted on the last slide can be compared to this 3.2 number. And what we see is that Douglas County's racial disproportionality is actually greater than the national average. This 3.2 number comes from a Bureau of Justice Statistics March 2020 report based on jail inmates in 2018. It's also important to put Douglas County's overall jail incarceration rate in context. So compared to the national average, Douglas County's jail incarceration rate is lower. The rate in Douglas County last year was 179 people in jail per 100,000 people. In jails nationwide in 2018, the rate was 226. So it is possible for a county to have a lower than average jail incarceration rate, but still have significant racial disparities. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. Basically, what we're doing is we're incarcerating black residents at about the national average and incarcerating other groups at a rate lower than the national average. And we can see that here with this table. So what I do is I get the standing jail population on 2 dates, May 14th and January 31st, to have a pre-COVID and a post-COVID time period, and analyze and calculate the jail incarceration rates. And what we see is the black rate is close to the national average for jails, but the rates for other groups like whites, Native Americans, Asians, and Hispanics are lower than the national average. This is a little disconcerting, but it helps explain why the black rate is so much higher than the white rate, and it gives us a little context for the disproportionality. All right, so with that, I'd like to bring up a question. So why is the disparity between the black and white jail incarceration rate so much greater than the booking rate? As you notice, there's a disproportionate number of black and Hispanic people that are in the jail, more so than that are booked into the jail. The booking population is sort of that churn group that has a lot of people coming and going. The answer is that black inmates stay longer than white inmates in DCCF. As you can see, the average number of days in jail for black inmates is a lot higher. Part of this disparity has to do with the seriousness of the offenses that people come into jail for. But this great of a disparity is very troubling on its face, and it suggests some inequities in the system after the point of arrest too. So before, we can kind of look at the booking rate, and that's sort of a reflection of disproportionality prior to the sort of judicial system taking over. And this sort of indicates something, some sort of disparity at either the DA's office stages or the judge's stages or the court sentencing. So we can look to see if the disparity holds for both pretrial and sentenced inmates separately and over time. Here's the average jail time for just sentenced inmates. The disparity between black and white inmates has grown in the last 2 years. The average jail time for Native American inmates has moved around somewhat. In 2019, we see that the black sentenced inmates stayed 91 days on average, Native American sentenced inmates stayed 69 days, and white sentenced inmates stayed 50 days on average. So this is a stark disparity. In 2019, black sentenced inmates were staying basically about 80% longer than white sentenced inmates. Now, the definition of sentence here can change, and you can sort of look at people who are sentenced for all their offenses and don't have any other pretrial offenses. And there's a whole lot of ways to sort of define sentence population. But basically, we see the same basic trends no matter what definition we use. We see the sort of troubling trend where the black-white disparity has sort of grown in the last couple of years. And you know what, it's hard to sort of come up with explanations for this. It could be that bookings have declined. Since bookings have declined in the last year, it may be that law enforcement is just arresting more serious Black offenders, and that's why these more serious Black offenders are getting more time because they're not arresting the less serious Black offenders. I don't know. There are a number of explanations that we can kind of look into with future data analysis, but on its face, this disparity is sort of troubling because it is about 40 days difference in 2019 for Black and white census inmates. So this is the average days in jail for just pre-trial inmates. These are people who are awaiting trial who are presumed to be innocent. And Black inmates are staying about 2.5 days longer in each year. So there is a disparity with the pretrial inmates too, but it's just sort of a little bit more consistent year to year. Now, the Native American mean does jump around a little bit. Part of it's the smaller sample size with Native Americans, but part of it is just, I think their average time does fluctuate depending on individual outliers a little too. So while these disparities are troubling on their face, we want to statistically control for several factors to see if the disparities remain after introducing those controls. So first, we'd want to control for the number and types of charges. If Black or Native American residents are committing more serious offenses, then that could explain why they are in jail longer. Similarly, if one racial group has more cases handled by district court, the more serious court, and one has more handled by municipal court, the court that handles misdemeanors, we would want to control for that too. We might also want to control for case type, whether the inmates committed a felony or a misdemeanor or both. Judicial status, that refers to whether a case is pretrial or sentence or referred to another jurisdiction. Age and gender are also important to control for because race may be correlated with age or gender, and those factors may be associated with systematically longer or shorter jail stays. Note that we don't control for prior criminal record of individuals booked into jail or for victims' statements, which can influence bond amounts. So, you know, we don't control for everything. No model ever controls for everything, but we do our best to sort of control for a number of external factors. We can carry out this statistical control using a multivariate linear regression model. In short, this method is used to determine the effect of one variable while holding other variables constant. The outcome we're analyzing in the model is log of jail days. So in keeping with statistical best practices, the jail days data are transformed to the log of jail days because otherwise the distribution is highly uneven. Basically, we want the outcome variable to be normally distributed and the assumptions of regression hold better for normally distributed outcome variables. And so by taking the log of days, the distribution sort of shifts and becomes more normal and we can do better statistics on it. All right, so the data we're using is all 2019 releases from DCCF. This analysis, though, has also been run using the last 4 years of data, and the results are basically the same, too. But I can talk a little bit more about that later. So I'll let you read through this. This is the list of variables that we include in the model, and I'll just pause here for a second. So stepping back, what this analysis will tell us is that if two people have the same offense and the same gender and age and other characteristics, and one is white and one is Black, here's what the sort of typical difference in jail stays will be in terms of the time they're in jail. And if the racial disparities hold with all these variables controlled for, then that would be a first step towards saying that being Black or Native American causes longer jail stays. And sort of cause is the word that we're interested in because we don't want Black or Native American disproportionality to sort of actually be caused by something else, like they're committing longer, more serious offenses. We want to see whether or not race actually causes the longer jail stays. So does anyone have any questions while I'm at it? I can just pause for a second. Yeah, Graham. I think you're on mute.
it's not too important, but why do you use age squared?
Oh, that's just to sort of account for any curvilinear effects of age. Basically, in a linear regression model, if you include a variable, it shows the effect of that variable across all levels of that variable. So the effect of age would have to be constant for young people and old people. But with this, you can insert age and age squared, and it can tell you if basically young people have a lower likelihood of getting, or a higher likelihood of getting low jail times. And then if it rises in middle age, and then if the effect kind of goes back down at higher ages, you can kind of account for that with age and age squared. So it can account for sort of curvilinear effects of variables. It's a common statistical technique that people use if they think there might be sort of a complicated relationship between age and the outcome variable.
Aaron Grant asks, how about home address? Does that have an impact?
No, that's a great idea. And I didn't get into controlling for address too much. You know, zip code does have an effect actually, because I have people zip code where they live. And basically, if you live in sort of more rich, well-off zip codes, you are staying less time in jail, all else being equal. So that would be an interesting thing to sort of delve into, especially looking at sort of socioeconomic effects to see if, you know, there's any effects of coming from areas that are a little bit less well off. So there is an effect of zip code, but I think a great secondary analysis would be to look at whether or not you're a Douglas County resident. You know, because some people sort of criticize the system here for saying, hey, you know, we're right in between Topeka and Kansas City. You're getting a lot of people who just don't really care about Lawrence and are committing crimes and getting busted here. And they are sort of skewing the average. What I found is that that doesn't seem to be the case. Basically, it seems like the people who are Douglas County residents are the same racial makeup as the people who are not Douglas County residents. It's a little bit different, but you don't get vastly different conclusions if you're analyzing just Douglas County residents versus not Douglas County residents. But, you know, more formally, yes, I would like to control for that in a future analysis.
Matt, this is Jennifer Ball. Is there any way, I'm sort of curious, it kind of goes with the income question about would making bail, I mean, that could affect, right, how long somebody was in jail. Is there any way to control for that?
Yeah, absolutely. And bail matters a lot. Your bail, if it's set at a high level, might mean you don't get out pre-trial earlier than, you know, than you want to be let out. So there is a way of controlling for that, and I certainly can try to do that. The problem is just that there's different types of bail. So people can either have no bail set, meaning like you don't get bail, you're not going to be released. You can also have an OR bond set, like a own recognizance bonds, where you're let out without paying anything. But if you don't show up for your court date, they make you pay the money in the end. Or you can have a cash bond, or you can have a cash or surety bond where you get a bail bondsman to kind of pay the whole thing, and you just pay 10% to the bail bondsman. So there's so many different types of bonds that it's a little bit complicated to sort of control for it. But actually what we're doing is we're conducting our own analysis of bond now, and we'll kind of have some separate results on that for the next CJCC meeting. Sorry, not the next one, but the one in September. So the CJCC meetings, the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council meetings, are open to the public, and we'll actually have a little bit of analysis of bonds and failure to appears and that kind of stuff. So hopefully that'll shed more analysis, more light on the racial disparities analysis as sort of a secondary analysis. But in this particular analysis, I'm not actually controlling for bond type or bond amount or anything like that.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so I think the results may clear up some additional questions if there are any. These are the predictions from the model. So basically, I don't show the individual sort of coefficients that indicate the effects of different variables, but what I do is just show what the model predicts each racial group is staying on average. So the first result in the left-hand column shows that white inmates stay about 1 day on average controlling for other factors. Black inmates stay about 22% longer, about 1.3 days. Native Americans stay about 35% longer, about 1.4 days. And the difference between Black and white predictions, and the difference between the Native American and white predictions are statistically significant. This means we can rule out that they are the result of random variation in the data. Note that the Hispanic difference is statistically significant when we pool more years of data to get a larger sample. So Hispanics are actually staying a little bit less than whites for the same types of offenses when you control for everything. We can also generate predictions for a hypothetical failure to appear booking. So what we do here is we set the failure to appear variable to 1. We set other variables to specific values and then set the race variable to white and see what the model predicts. And the model predicts that the group stays 6.2 days on average. Then we switch the focus to race as Black and see what the model predicts. And that predicts 7.6 days in jail. The only thing we change here is the race of the person booked into jail. So for this specific offense profile, we're looking at someone who's booked into jail on failure to appear with at least 1 pretrial charge and 3 total charges, a felony, a misdemeanor, and an unknown charge, and at least 1 district court case. So I wanted to get a really sort of specific offense profile to say, if you just change race, what do you get as the difference in jail times? And again, it's saying that Black inmates are staying about 22% longer and Native Americans are staying about 35% longer. So what we can also do is look at a hypothetical burglary booking. This will show us an offense profile associated with a little bit longer stays. So here we analyze a person sentenced to jail for burglary with 10 total charges, which is a lot, including 1 felony and 1 district court case. And what we see is that they're staying 111 days if they're Black and 122 days if they're white, but only 90 days if they're white. So I can put these into charts just to show you a little bit more visually what's going on. Here are the predictions for the hypothetical failure to appear booking. And this is for the hypothetical burglary booking. So the differences really are stark. Black inmates are staying about 21 days longer than white inmates on average, holding other factors constant. And Native Americans are staying about 32 days longer than white inmates on average, holding other factors constant. So, I mean, that's a lot of days. And again, the model doesn't control for everything. We'll get into some sort of limitations and discussions of this more broadly, but it is very troubling on its face and something that we need to delve into more deeply. So limitations and extensions. The first limitation is that the data don't necessarily shed direct light on why the disparities arise. The results do suggest at least some disproportionate minority contact by law enforcement because the number of bookings is just so disproportionately Black and a little bit of Hispanic disproportionality too. So it does indicate that unless Black residents of Douglas County are committing offenses at a much higher rate, there is some disproportionate contact there by law enforcement. Research has also shown that there are many points in the criminal justice system at which the disparities can arise. It can be law enforcement, prosecutors, pretrial decision-making, and judges. There are any number of explanations that we have yet to examine. But one thing we know is that racial disparities tend to compound as a person moves through the stages of the justice system. So for example, if you are held in jail longer pre-trial, you are then more likely to plead guilty and get a longer sentence in order to get out. So a person of color being held longer in jail pre-trial has consequences. So we want to stop the disparities as sort of early in the system as possible. Another thing we can say is that the evidence presented here shows that racial inequities exist. So instead of anecdotes and guesses about the extent of the inequities, we have some evidence. Unfortunately, the results do show that disparities appear extensive for Black residents in Douglas County, and when controlling for other factors, they are extensive for Native American residents too. And while many counties have racial disparities, it's not uncommon to have large Black-white race disparities in incarceration rates. Most counties aren't actively trying to understand them. So what we hope this analysis can do is sort of be a springboard for further research that identifies where and why the disparities arise. And by measuring these inequities, we take sort of an important first step towards correcting them. So for instance, this last week, I just got data from the DA's office for the first time, and we're going to start to analyze who's charged to see if people who are charged or people whose charges are dismissed are more likely to be white or black. And that'll be another step towards unpacking the sort of black box of where the disparities arise and what's causing them. The courts in Douglas County have also sort of granted me some access to data. So hopefully we'll be analyzing courts data as sort of the next step as well. So another limitation of the analysis is that the regression approach is correlational. The gold standard would be a randomized experiment, and we would sort of randomly assign someone to be either white, black, or Native American, and then see how they are treated by the system and how long they stay in jail. But unfortunately, that's not possible. So what we do is we control for as many things as possible and hope that this gets us closer to the causal estimate as possible. And right now, the causal estimate post-booking is showing that that blacks are staying about 22% longer, and Native Americans are staying about 35% longer. So the model also doesn't control for all variables. As I mentioned, it doesn't control for criminal history, but models never control for everything, and this is sort of an important first step at getting these sort of causal estimates. An extension of this project would be to compare Douglas County to other Kansas counties. So at one point I presented a national rate ratio and Douglas County was higher, but it may be more instructive to examine other Kansas counties that share similar characteristics as us. So I leave this analysis to a future sort of research. Future analysis might also look at the overlap between socioeconomic disparities and race disparities. So this is a figure that I put together on the effects of education. We can also analyze education, zip code, as I mentioned before, and other variables on jail time. And what this result shows here is that people with less education are staying longer than people with more education, holding other factors constant. So we don't have income or socioeconomic status, but education is a rough proxy for income and socioeconomic status. And because some groups of color are more likely to suffer from socioeconomic disadvantage, they may be sort of doubly penalized by the criminal justice system in the county if there are those who have less education or less socioeconomic status and who are people of color, then the system might sort of doubly penalize them. That would be a problem. One thing that I just want to note is that the racial disparities in jail time remain even after controlling for education. So we know that the racial disparities are robust and a real problem that must be addressed directly. But I think that it is worth noting that the disparity in jail time is lower when we control for education, which suggests that some part of the problem is greater socioeconomic disadvantage among Black residents. So basically, there's a lot we can do with future analysis by looking at the effects of education and income on these disparities. But I think as a unique first step, we were able to analyze education and find that there is an effect of education on stays in jail time. So with that, I am all finished. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Or if there's anything I left out, I'm happy to address that as well.
I have a question, if it's okay. This is Jennifer Ball. Paul, are you trying to acknowledge people, or is it okay if I ask my question?
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'm just curious, and this really doesn't have much. I mean, your study was really interesting, and I enjoyed it. But I'm curious as to, like, you're saying that more research would have to be done. Like, for instance, your comment about so unless certain groups are committing crimes at a higher rate, right, than white people, or at this rate, it was something like 3 times, right, then we expect there's something else explaining what's going on there. And I'm curious because I know, like, with studies on drug arrests, one of the ways they kind of figure out, the disparities there is they do surveys where they ask people, how often do you use drugs? How often do you buy drugs? What are the demographics? What are your demographics? What are the demographics of the people you're buying drugs from, et cetera? And then we see that even self-reported drug use is, about equal across races, yet there's, so many more people of color in prison over drug use and selling and such than whites. So is that kind of how you would do the research on other types of crimes too, or how is it that we get at crimes that are never that police never arrest somebody for, or they never get, they never end up in the system? So how is research done on that? I'm really just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a question that a lot of researchers want to answer. So if you have any insights on it, I imagine a lot of economists and crime analysts would be very interested in knowing. But there are a couple ways that I think people do it. So for instance, the traffic stop study that I mentioned that Northeastern researchers are doing, they're getting a control group that's sort of supposed to be as free of racial bias as possible to sort of to sort of compare to the traffic stops data. So what they do is they analyze accidents under the presumption that basically law enforcement that goes out to accidents to sort of analyze those stops, that'll be as free from racial bias as possible, because those people of all racial groups have accidents. And basically that will be sort of a baseline comparison for the racial disproportionality of sort of non-racially biased stops. And then you compare all the traffic stops that actually happen in Douglas County and Lawrence to the accident stops. And that gives you a good sense of how much of it is bias and if law enforcement is overstopping people of color. So that's one way of doing it. You can have a control group like that. And here we go. Here's a response from Aaron Grant. In San Antonio back in 2009-10, they had cops write down what they thought the race of the individual was, and they pulled someone over to determine bias. And that's another thing that the racial stops analysis is doing. What we had to do is get a form for all the law enforcement to fill out, and it was sort of complicated because getting multiple police departments on board with the same form is tough, because you have Baldwin, Eudora, Highway Patrol, Sheriff, KUPD, Lawrence PD, all using the same form, and that was sort of tough. So the researchers basically had to get all the police departments using the same form to sort of record whose race, what the race was for everyone being stopped. And that legwork was done. And now that legwork's done, I think for the future, we can analyze that data. And I think I may actually get some access to that data once they kind of continue doing it after the study. But for now, the study is continuing, and basically it's going to go on for another 6 months after the original data collection stage, just because of COVID means there were just so few stops by people of color that you didn't have a large enough sample size. So we're going to get a little bit larger sample size by extending the data for another 6 months. But just to go back to your question too, I mean, I think it's really tough to kind of get an estimate of what the underlying number of offenses are in the public. And, surveys are one way of doing it. But, I can't think of another great way of doing it. I think another way you can do it is just sort of control for as many things in the model as possible, and just control for how serious the offense was, if it was a felony or misdemeanor or other, the criminal history of the person. And so you just do as many controls as possible. And I know that's not the most satisfying answer, but it'll give you a little bit better way of sort of coming up with the estimate that you're looking for. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit more. And I think the law enforcement stop will have a good control group with that accident population.
Yeah, thanks. It's just the thing that people argue so often that I wish I had a good answer for. It's like when you say, oh, but arrests are this multiple of white arrests, and then there's always that argument back that, well, people of color commit more crime or whatever, and it's so hard to point to good evidence that that's not the case, right? It's just, but thank you. That's it's interesting, and an interesting statistical problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Matt, are you familiar with the book by our friend from KU, Chuck Epp, and his associate, who wrote the book titled Pulled Over, an analysis of 4,000 traffic stops in Kansas City?
I've heard of it, and I know some of the basic conclusions, but I haven't read it.
roughly, in Kansas City, 85% of the white drivers that were pulled over were for a actual infraction like speeding or reckless driving, drunk driving, and so on. And 15% were investigative, for example, a broken tail light or headlight. The blacks were pulled over 15% of the time it was for a traffic infraction, speeding, reckless driving. 85% of the time, the black drivers that were pulled over for investigative purposes, which you could read as being harassment or unwarranted racial profiling and so on. We've got the book in our library. I'll get it and make sure it gets in your hands. It's good reading.
That would be great. I really should read it. And Chuck Epp has been intimately involved in a lot of criminal justice coordinating council analyses and happenings. He's a member of the CJCC, and he's a member of the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Work Group too. And he put out a sort of goal for us to sort of reduce racial disparities in the jail population by 25% over the next year. And at the CJCC meeting, other people have challenged criminal justice actors to reduce the overall jail population by 25%. And he, doubled up on that and said, hey, let's reduce racial disparities by 25% too. And I think that's a very admirable goal. I mean, and I hope we get there. And he has a lot of research chops, and I think he'll really inform the conversation a lot. One thing that worries me a little bit is that the percentage of people who are in jail who are Black has actually gone up a little bit during COVID. It's now, I think, about 28 or 29%, and it was about 24% about 6 months ago. And so that's really worrisome. I think actually it was 28% last week. So hopefully we're not moving long-term in the wrong direction, but we really do need to sort of double our efforts to sort of reduce the number of people of color who are coming in. And I think traffic stops are a way to do it. I think there's a lot of analysis we can do about looking at neighborhood enforcement targeting, like what neighborhoods are sort of targeted more than others. And, also just doubling down on the data analysis. I know people over at LPD are great data analysis. They have a great data analysis guy named Jason over there, Jason Hodge. And, I think there's a lot we can get to with just a little bit more data analysis too.
Yeah, I'll ignore waving hands here for a minute. I was on mute earlier and address a couple that came in via chat. One from Ellen, I presume Ellen Gold. Do we have any information about why people burgle? Is this poverty or greed, or do we know? And that's addressed to Matt, I presume, although it's addressed to everyone.
While Matt gets hooked up again, I would just say that there appears to be a pattern of people burglaring either to get drugs or get things to sell in order to buy drugs. But Matt, do you have more information on why people burgle?
I don't. The only thing I can say is that the number of burglary people in jail has declined a little bit under COVID. We looked at the people who are in jail under their most serious offense, and the number of people whose most serious offense was burglary actually declined a little bit. So I think that indicates we're keeping fewer people in for financial crimes under COVID. I know we're also, there's fewer people in for drug crimes. There's fewer people now with COVID in for, I think, assault. There's more domestic violence cases now in jail, but low-level traffic and misdemeanor offenses are also in jail at a lower rate. But why people burglar, that underlying reason I can't shed any light on, unfortunately.
And there's a note, actually a couple from Aaron Grant. Aaron, do you want to come in and phrase yours as a question?
Oh, no, that wasn't a question. It was a shameless plug for a research agenda and offering to help. I think I offered like some people for running for office too. I'm just looking for a more applied research agenda, and I had worked for, we called it the Justice System Coordinating Committee, but it's basically what you guys have. So it was a plug more than anything. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? We've got some time yet. I'll make a comment that I'm very glad that Douglas County is doing this kind of analysis, and it seems like the analysis is in good hands. Do you know if similar work's going on in some of the other high population counties like Sedgwick or Shawnee or Wyandotte, Johnson?
You know, I don't know. This analysis just kind of came out of, basically, I started this job not too long ago, about 7 months ago, and a couple months into it, as I was learning the data system, I started discovering some pretty big disparities between Black and white residents, and it really was quite large. And so I, approached my boss about it, and he said, we haven't really got any great evidence to date on what those disparities are in Douglas County. So I sort of delved, he authorized me to delve into it in a little bit more detail. And it was sort of an exploratory analysis, really, is what it was. And it developed into this. But I don't know if a similar process is going on in Sedgwick County or Johnson County. I mean, I hope with all the recent fervor over race relations in America, there are more analyses like this happening. But I do know that we're kind of unique in what we're doing with the law enforcement study. I mean, we're paying, I think the rate was like $130,000 for the study to do this whole law enforcement contact study to see if there's disproportionate minority contact. And I don't think that's a standard thing that's done by counties. I mean, I think that we are making some progress, and I think that we're making a lot of progress, by requesting data from different offices, from the DA's office, from the courts, and other things like that. And I think our racial and ethnic disparities work group has been really active in trying to get to the bottom of some of these disparities, which I commend people for. But I have a sense that that's not happening in other counties. We're part of a peer learning network here that we got a grant from the MacArthur Foundation and NACO, the National Association of Counties, to do what's called a peer learning network, where we learn from other counties on what they're doing in terms of people with mental illness in the jail, and then also in terms of racial disparities. And it seems like other counties aren't doing this kind of deep, in-depth exploration and sort of self-exploration into their racial disparities. And I mean, we actually had a lot to share in some of those calls, and it doesn't seem like the other counties are doing that as much as they should. So yeah, I can't give you any kind of survey analysis or definitive results, but I think we are making a lot more progress than the average typical county.
Thank you. Just to make sure I understand and everybody else understands, the correlation you showed last there on education means that if you commit the same crime, it doesn't have anything to do with how education correlates with how often you're a criminal. But if you commit the same crime and you've got a PhD, you're going to spend less time in jail on the average. Is that what it says?
Yeah, that's, oh, go ahead.
No, that's what I wanted to establish. And presumably they don't ask you about education. It must be the other things that go along with it. You're probably a little bit better socioeconomic status, and you showed a correlation there that was similar, but maybe not quite as pronounced.
Yeah, what the result of the education slide is showing is, yeah, if you have higher education, then even controlling for the offense type and how serious the offense was and everything, you're staying less time in jail. And you know what the causal mover is probably something else. The causal mover is probably not education itself, but it's like maybe your ability to hire a good lawyer, or maybe your ability to aid your defense in a way that's more introspective or something like that. But it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that education does have an effect. And even when you control for education, the race effects are still there. So it's race is still a problem regardless of education, and education is a problem regardless of race. So it's like they're both sort of things that we need to get at in future analyses.
Okay, so Matt, thank you for your good work, and we're very proud of you. And Chuck Epps, thank you, Graham, for pointing out Chuck Epps' great work. He's a political science professor at Kansas University. And he made an entire series of chapters on the training that police officers are given. So any part of your plan or grant research and analysis going to be on your training manuals and the questions asked and the questions that are particular to race by neighborhood, income, education, et cetera, there might be, that might be a very interesting study to see if what you're telling police officers is creating this conclusion.
Yeah, I know that a lot of officers now have crisis intervention team training in Douglas County. I think about 80% of officers have the CIT training, crisis intervention team training, which works on de-escalating crises. But I don't know what other training they get, and I think that would be a great way of analyzing it. In previous talks when I've given this, the criminal justice coordinator has been on the call too, and he's been able to kind of answer those types of questions about what training we're doing and what are sort of future steps for analyzing training. But I think that's a really good point. I think as we get into this analysis more and we sort of look at the law enforcement side, I think especially with the law enforcement contact study, when those results come out, we'll start to look at training. I think I know that a lot of criminal justice actors are going to be taking implicit bias training in the coming year. The CJCC is doing an implicit racial bias training on August 29th. The entire CJCC is, and then assuming that goes well, that training is going to go out to other correctional officers and members of the CJC, basically people who do criminal justice work in the county. So hopefully that kind of implicit bias training will get extended to other groups, maybe even law enforcement. I don't know, but I think training is definitely the way to go.
Well, providing training for people, but what I'm saying is look at implicit bias in the existing training manuals. Study what you're training to see is there implicit bias in there. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, we're into our coffee and conversation time now, so I think we can kind of make a smooth transition. We have time for one more question since it's Carol that wants to ask. I'll cue her in.
I have an inroad here. But I think even beyond the training, people develop perceptions of others throughout their life. And I think that the perception of the people doing the judging makes a difference too. You automatically assume that someone with a PhD has a certain background that would sort of change how you interpret what they did. Sorry, that's it.
You'd hope.
Yeah, and I think perceptions, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you would hope if they had a PhD, they'd know better, but go ahead, Matt.
Yeah.
That's what you think.
Well, and I think perceptions by law enforcement are a major issue. I think what Teresa was saying about implicit bias is something we should look into for law enforcement too, because studies have shown that especially in communities where there are fewer people of color, sometimes they implicitly assume people of color are more criminal oriented. And I think social psychology studies have shown that. And it's unfortunate because, we as a liberal or a more progressive city like Lawrence shouldn't be disproportionately incarcerating people of color. We have a small population of color, and it's really unfortunate that those disparities for the Black population are as high as they are. And I think there are some things that we need to look at with the sort of perceived criminality of people in traffic stops and stuff. So hopefully these future studies can do more. I think Barbara Johnson said in the chat, what is your prediction on what the CJCC will do with these studies? How will the studies affect racial disparities? I mean, I'm hoping there can be more active things that come from it. Like we can actually sort of, help influence the training regime of police and sort of work on these issues that we've been talking about today. So hopefully a lot will come of it. We'll see.
Well, Matt, I hope you'll stay with us for a few minutes for coffee and conversation. I think we have up till 10:45. Is that right? Amanda. We can't offer you a cup of coffee except symbolically.
Yeah, we can stay on until 10:45. That's fine.
Thank you. I think there's one, I wouldn't call it an elephant in the room, but I hope I can say this without being biased. I think it's a fact that Blacks commit more crimes, and we need to control for that. And I think that gets us back to the really hard question to tackle, is the socioeconomic aspect of it. And I guess you can control for that if you control for socioeconomic status and see if there's a disparity between white and black. And I think some studies show that no, there isn't, like the drug study, that there isn't any difference. But that's both a perception and also a fact, I would say.
Sorry, the air conditioning here just turned on and turned off for a second. Can you, the last part of your question, I just didn't hear that, sorry.
Oh, I just said, well, I was actually making more of a statement than a question. I think that the studies on drugs are very important because they show that that there is no essential difference between races there. And in fact, Hispanics were lower on drug usage and blacks and whites were about the same. But what I'm asking is, can we parse out how much disadvantaged backgrounds and home situations and so forth impact this, societal problems that are different from the justice system problems?
Yeah, that's such a hard thing, because the problem is with any sort of model, if you put all these variables in, a lot of them will matter all simultaneously. And so the sort of home influences will maybe matter, the background characteristics will matter, how much you commit crimes will matter, the justice system variables will matter quite a lot, and the law enforcement contact variables will matter too. And so how you weigh each variable sort of against another one is tough, like which matters more. I think sometimes you can say they all kind of matter, but in terms of controlling for the underlying amount of crime, that one is tough, and I think we talked about that before. I mean, I don't know who's, I think on drug crimes, it is similar across races. I don't know on other crimes in Lawrence what's actually happening. I mean, my guess is that it's just, the problem is the disproportionality is so out of whack. You know, it's like 3 times more black people are being arrested, that it's just, there's something that's happening that's not quite right, and we don't know what that is, and we just have to sort of get at that more, and trying to figure out the variables that matter are sort of the struggle for future research. So I hope that the law enforcement context study will shed light on it. So
thank you. Well, another thing, Barbara Thompson, you raised your hand.
I think this is a really naive question, but exactly how is it that someone's race is determined and recorded for people?
That's a great question, actually. And my understanding is that the arresting officer, the booking officer puts it in. The person who's booking them into jail puts it in, and it's self-reported from the inmate. But I do know that the booking officer's reports can be influenced by the arresting officer's reports if they're a different person. So sometimes it can be reported from an officer, but I think for the most part, it's self-reported. So that's actually, it does matter, I think, because if it was just taken from only officers' reports, then it would be sort of less objective. I think it's more accurate when it comes from the actual bookie himself or herself.
I just wrote this in the chat, but when I was working in Austin, people would be booked in on different races, on different bookings. Like one time they'd be black, next time they'd be Hispanic. Do you see any of that in your data they've looked at?
No, I haven't actually, but I assume that happens sometimes. I mean, they do a good job about keeping the sort of inmate number set. Once you're booked in once, then if you're booked in like a year later, they keep you under the same inmate number. And so I think they keep your same race variable there, or your same race variable entry. But I'm not 100% positive. I mean, there may be some sort of discrepancies in the race data that I'm not aware of. So I can look into that.
Yeah, I was just curious. Thank you.
One thing that jumped out at me in your statistics were Asians. And that's small population, so there's a statistical question there. And there's probably an education factor there too. But I'm wondering if that's a strong clue of family influence, because the perception is that most Asians have very strong family connections and rather strict family strictures. And I wonder if that's the explanation for the very low incarceration rate.
I suspect that there's a big income effect happening because Asians in Douglas County have higher average incomes and can probably afford attorneys and better representation. Or maybe they're committing less serious offenses or something. But all I know is that they are getting less time for similar crimes, it appears. But again, the sample size is an issue. It's like you said, the sample size is small enough that you can't draw a lot of conclusions from it. In fact, you really can't rule out that the Asian mean in jail time is significantly different from the white mean. But it looks like if you got enough years of data, it would show that it's actually a little less controlling for everything else. So that Asians and Hispanics are actually getting less time for similar offenses. And that may be some bias too. I mean, it could be some sort of family cultural things like you're saying. I don't really know. But it could just be sort of bias in what the judges and law enforcement see too. Maybe judges and law enforcement see Asian Americans as more law abiding in some ways. I don't know what the perception is, or it could just be a simple like thing where education and income is the main causal mover, and really they just can afford better attorneys and get out quicker because they have better representation. So that's a good question. And Hispanics are another group I'd be interested in seeing because I know that there's a lot of anti-Hispanic bias in some states on the West Coast. And I didn't seem to find any evidence of that here in Douglas County, at least from the analysis that I did at least. So, I mean, if you could pool the last 4 years of data, you actually see a negative effect of being Hispanic on the amount of time you stay. But pre-booking, you saw a positive effect though. So, I mean, Hispanics seem to be booked into jail at a rate greater than their proportion in the population. But once they're in jail, they seem to be staying less time for similar offenses, which is interesting. So I don't know exactly what's causing that, to be honest.
The statistic that I was remembering on Asians was not the time in jail. I didn't realize that that was different, but the booking rate of Asians was also very low, wasn't it?
Yeah, I believe so. Yes. Yeah, it was the booking rate was low and they were staying less time. Yeah. I mean, the problem is just there's so few people in that group. Like at any given time, there's usually just one person in the county jail who's Asian. So yeah, it's hard to draw conclusions.
It might be interesting. This would not cover the whole spectrum of those incarcerated that you've been looking at, but if you could somehow have a study that gets people together who have similar backgrounds in their lives as you can establish, and see if people of different races are incarcerated longer, even though there's nothing obvious in their background that would make them different. You know, they're on the same level socioeconomically in all different ways, to see if there's a difference between how long they're incarcerated. It's not a say that you would do probably, but Be kind of
Yeah.
interesting to see what happens, I think.
Yeah, and there's a couple of ways of doing that kind of analysis. I mean, the statistical control method that I used with linear regression was attempting to do that basically by saying like, if you have two people with the exact same sort of burglary offense, the exact same sort of number of felonies and number of misdemeanors and number of charges and all these kind of things, and the only thing you change is race. Here's how long they're staying, more or less, if they're black or white. So that's what I attempted to do, but there are other ways of doing it too. Like there's what you call matching methods, where you match individuals in the data set, sort of like what you're talking about. Like you get two people who have all these various characteristics that are really similar, and then you get another two people whose characteristics are really, really similar, and then another two people, and then you compare the A group to the B group to see if they are different in terms of how long they're staying. So there's a lot of different sort of statistical ways of doing it, but they're all sort of centered around the same thing about saying, if you hold everything else constant, sort of ceteris paribus, everything else constant, what is the effect of race? And again, the ultimate way of doing it would be a randomized controlled trial and to randomly assign people to be different races, but and then compare to see how they're treated by the justice system and how long they get in jail. But you can't really do that, unfortunately. So we're left with our sort of observational studies as it is.
Thank you for everything you've said and done.
Oh yeah, I hope it goes. I hope this work continues. I really do. There's a lot more we can do, and I think the county is taking some good steps and is really trying to get to the bottom of it, and they're helping me in as many ways as possible. So hopefully in another 6 months, we'll have some more results.
Well, let's have a silent clapping, or whoever claps the loudest will get the screen. So thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you all, and it was great to talk with you.